Well, good morning, everybody. Uh, Great to be here again this morning. Thankful to, as always, thankful that we're able to come and worship this morning. I guess if we were still doing outside Sundays, this would have been our first Sunday since Memorial Day that we wouldn't have been able to been outside. We had a good run, but we do have kind of a pretty dreary day today, but appreciate everybody being with you and everybody that's at home. Just excited you're with us as well, and thank you for tuning in and being with us this morning. As always, thank you to Macy, thank you to Brian for making all what we've done the past 6 months possible as far as broadcasting, and we just really appreciate y'all and your part in the service. Anyway, high notes for this morning. It's had a dreary weekend, but a wonderful weekend. And I know Sandy and Bobby and Kelsey, just an incredible weekend as far as Stephanie's wedding. It was a beautiful service and a beautiful wedding. And just excited for Stephanie and Luke. So everybody be praying for them as they're embark on their new life and just get to enjoy their being with each other. So that was just a great day yesterday. Anyway, getting into our lesson this morning, and we are wrapping up the first part of the fall quarter. We've been studying the Ten Commandments. And the title is A Fresh Look at the Ten Commandments and After God's Own Heart. Just as a little bit of prelude of what next week's lesson and what we're going to be finishing up the fall quarter with is called All In, a Life of Commitment. And so I'm excited about that. Those lessons, if we look through and look ahead in our material for next Sunday, the title of the lesson is Christ's Commitment to Us. The next Sunday is our commitment to Christ. Then we're looking at committed to His Word, committed to His church, committed to pray, committed to His worship, and committed to His mission. So the remainder part of the fall quarter just looks like just a really good, great material, and so we're excited about that. But like I said, we're wrapping up our study on the Ten Commandments this morning, and the title of our lesson is to honor all relationships. And the point of the lesson is integrity and contentment in Christ form the foundation for good relationships. Integrity and commitment in Christ form the foundation for good relationships. And as I prepared, and which started last night, I'm afraid to say, but as we look at this lesson and look at these verses, and as I thought about that, what it said there is the point. As Christians, a lot of times, and we've said this so many times, there's a lot of people in this world today that will never go in a church door. They'll never be in here. They'll never go in any church. And so we are the only church that they will ever know. And, I don't know about you, but as I really thought about that last night, and it really hit me as I laid down just when I was getting ready to go to sleep. That's a tremendous responsibility on each and every one of us, isn't it? Knowing that to some people we'll be the only church they ever visit. And as part of that responsibility is that if we live our lives with integrity and commitment and contentment, in Christ and who we believe in, we can be that direction to them and that church to them. But then the flip side of it is that we can also be a stumbling block and a deterrent for folks that we are the only church they'll ever visit. In these last group of verses right here, really cement that fact. And so I know a lot of us, I don't know, I hate to say it, but I'm going to. As I looked at my lesson last Sunday and just read over the verses real quick, I thought, wow, these verses are just, we know these verses, we understand them, and we believe them, but I didn't really, the whole idea of the of the importance of them didn't hit me until really last night. And so hopefully we can bring that out to each of us as we go through our lesson this morning. The first question in our book, and you don't have to, and I don't know if we're even going to go into this, but the first question I want you all to be thinking about is, who has been an example of personal integrity in your life? And just want everybody to think about that. I don't really want us to, because that's just too hard of a question to throw out there, because I think a lot of us would really need to think about that. But who has been an example of personal integrity in your life? So as we go through the lesson this morning, just be thinking about that. And we're going to get into our first group of verses. Again, we're looking at Exodus chapter 20, verses 15 through 16. And verse 15 says, "Thou shalt not steal." And then verse 16, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." So if we look at this, and you'll see where I was coming to when I said last week that I read the verses, and I thought, well, this is all, we know this, right? But the verse 15 says, "Thou shalt not steal." My Sunday school material goes into that, the meaning or the translation of that as being never steal or no stealing as the meaning of, or the translation of "thou shalt not steal." And we all read this verse, and we all, ever since we're little, and we know what this verse means, that is pretty self-explanatory, right? Thou shalt not steal. And stealing is taking something that's what? Not ours. But you know, there's a lot more to it than that. Cheating is a form of stealing, right? If we cheat, we're taking something that we didn't earn, that's not ours. Not using our time wisely. My book goes into the fact, if we're at work and we're not, giving our employer our time the way we're supposed to, that's a form of stealing. I think that's a slippery slope, and I don't want to get into it. My book went into it a little bit. I don't want to get into it because I think that none of us are married to our jobs. That ain't what we're supposed to be, and that our family's first, and I think that, but I do think we need to realize the fact that as Christians, as this idea of integrity goes, that we're to give an honest day's work for an honest day's wage. And, so I think that can be part of this, "thou shalt not steal." But again, I think this idea of cheating, I think this idea of making sure that we're doing what we say we're going to do, can all be wrapped up in this idea of "thou shalt not steal." But then we look at verse 16, and it says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor," meaning that we shouldn't lie. Now, we're all guilty of this, right? At least Jason is. This idea of not telling the truth. And I want to spend just a minute on this idea of not telling the truth. And this idea of us being the only church that a lot of people may ever see. We believe in the ultimate truth, and that is in God and in His Son, Christ Jesus. We believe that that's the ultimate truth, and that there's no falsification in that. That's the purest form of truth there is. I don't know how else to say it. What God says is true. What Christ says is true, and we believe that. But then as a Christian, when we go out into the world and we profess the truth in Jesus Christ, but then we don't profess the truth in our own lives, that's a stumbling block for others. Would y'all agree with that? I mean, I don't know how else to say it, and I don't want to stand up here and say that, Jason, that I don't falter at this, because certainly I do. And this idea about the truth and everything that we say and do is truthful. I think it's very, very important. When we talk about this idea of integrity, it's one of the main cornerstones is that what we say and what we do is truth. You know, if I go and proclaim that I'm a Christian and I believe what Christ did for me on the cross, but then I go and live my life a different way, in essence, I am being untruthful, right? And I think it all wraps up together in this verse. You know, I think about the first lie I ever remember telling. And there was probably more before that. But the first one I ever remember telling, I was probably 8 years old or 9 years old. And there was one of the neighborhood kids had come over, and I had a little three-wheeler. And I let the neighborhood kid ride the three-wheeler, and their parents were there, and they wrecked it. And they got kind of banged up a little bit, and so everybody come running outside, and I said, their parents said that they could ride it. And I knew that wasn't right. I knew that was a lie. And I remember that gut-wrenching feeling that came into my gut the minute I said those words. Does anybody else have a similar experience to me? And like I said, I'm sure there was a time before then I had lied, but that is the thing, and I'll never forget that gut wrenching. As soon as the words come out of my mouth, I knew they were not true, and I had just a pain in my stomach. I mean, just you know that feeling I'm talking about. And there's 2 points I want to make with that. Number one is that through further questioning, from them further questions, what did I continue to do? I continued to lie. So I had to make up another lie to cover up the lie that I told. And for each one of them, it was like I was just getting punched in the gut. But you continued on that path, and then it all blew over, and it was, no big deal after that. That's kind of how lies work, right? I mean, it ain't just when you're 8 years old, they continue. The first point I want to make on that little story of mine is that gut-wrenching feeling I had was from that conscience that God put into me that told me that what I was doing was wrong. That told me what I was doing was wrong. When I first said those words, it was just my word, right? There's nobody coming down on me. I didn't tell my dad that their parents said they could ride it, and Daddy said, well, that's a lie, because he didn't. He said, oh, okay. But yet that even though I wasn't in trouble, I had that gut, I don't know how to describe it other than just that sick feeling. Even though I wasn't caught, but I had that sick feeling because I was telling that lie. And that feeling comes from God, right? Even though at 8 years old, Bonnie, I knew what was right and wrong. I don't know that I knew what Exodus chapter 20, verse 16 said. I couldn't have told you that. But somehow I knew what I was doing was wrong. Guys, it goes back to this point with all these things that we're talking about. These commandments, this whole quarter that so far of lessons. We are created in God's image. And in doing so, we inherently know what we're doing is right or wrong. And for folks to say that there isn't a God, for folks to say that we just came from ooze, is that, in my opinion, proves the falsehood of those statements. It's the same thing with a lot of the commandments, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Let's go into the premarital sex part of that. I don't know this, thankfully, but there's something that tells me that when a young person, and whether they come from a Christian home or not a Christian home, they inherently know that they shouldn't be a part of that the first time. Would anybody agree with that statement I just said? I believe that with all my heart. I believe that inherently there's something in that says this is wrong. But then after you do it a time, and the same thing with wine, same thing with stealing. Once you break these commandments, and we can go even further into honoring God and to putting God first, but once you break one, you get that gut-wrenching feeling. But then the second time, it ain't as bad. And the third time, it ain't as bad. And the fourth time, it ain't as bad. And it's just like my hand, right? And nobody probably can see, but I've been shearing trees since July. I got a lot of hard spots on my hand. Them hard spots came from that first day of shearing. Them first 3 days of shearing, they wasn't hard spots, they was blisters. And then them blisters hurt that first 2 or 3 days. But then them blisters turned into what? Calluses. It's the same thing with sin, right? That first time I told that lie, when I was 8 years old, it hurt, and I had this gut-wrenching feeling, and then I had to tell another lie to cover up that first lie. And I had this, you get that sick feeling. But after you lie and you lie and you lie, you quit getting that sick feeling anymore, because your heart has become what? Calloused. And I believe that with all of these things in our lives. It's easy for the world to say, well, these are just old laws. These are just, it doesn't pertain today. But I believe with all my heart, and I really, really, really believe this. I believe with all my heart that, folks, we are created in the image of God. And that first time we fail on any of these 10 things, that there's a sickening feeling. And we know we're wrong, whether you've been to a church or not. But yet, as we continue to do it and do it and do it, we become calloused. And then it doesn't bother us anymore. Them calluses on my hand, I don't get blisters anymore, do I? My hand's done got tough, so I don't have a blister. And I think that's what happens to us when it pertains to any of God's laws, that we become callous to it. And therefore, by being callous to it, we see our society the way it is today. Our society today says it don't matter whether you commit adultery or not. Our society today says it's okay to lie, steal, cheat to get what you want. Our society today even honors people that do such things. Is that an accurate statement? It goes back to these calluses over it. I want to use one more example, and I've used it many times in Sunday school in the past. And it goes back to a toddler and asking that toddler to tell one of his siblings they are sorry. And it's like that toddler, they've admitted they've done wrong, but to actually tell someone they're sorry, to admit that much that they were in the wrong, and they would rather take a spanking than they would to turn to somebody and say, I'm sorry. Now, they're raised in our home. We've brought them, and they've sat right there every Sunday for years and years. But yet, at 3 years old, they don't understand any of this stuff. But all they understand is they don't want to admit that they were wrong and say, I'm sorry. And you mean to tell me that there isn't something conflicting going on from the very beginning of our reasoning that God has put in our hearts? I don't know. I can't think of a better example than that. That's that conflict from our flesh. If God had not created us in His own image, then that little toddler would have no reason to know that what he inherently, deep down, what they did was wrong and that they needed to apologize for it. Is that an accurate statement? If we were created if we just come out of ooze and came from monkeys, I tell that toddler to just say you're sorry, they would just immediately say I'm sorry, right? Because there would be no consequences in that. There's nothing telling them to do it or not to do it if we were truly evolved. But that's not the case. We were truly created in God's own image, and therefore there's a turmoil between our flesh and our created Father that boils inside of us from the very, very beginning. And it goes back to these laws that God gave through Moses all those many, many years ago. Guys, is there any discussion before we go on? Our next group of verses is going to conclude the Ten Commandments. It's Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. And it says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." And we know verse 17. We've heard verse 17 here. We know the commandment, thou shalt not covet. But you know, this last commandment kind of wraps up all the other commandments that deal with others, right? You know, the first 4 commandments deal with our relationship with God. The last 6 commandments deal with our relationship with others. I think there's something to that. Obviously, God, the first 4 about dealing with God were the first ones, because we've got to get our life right with dealing with God before we can even begin to let these other 6 be meaningful to us. But I think there's a lot to be said that there's 4 commandments dealing with God and 6 commandments dealing with our neighbor. What does that say? It says the importance of each other is. It's the importance of our life and how our lives affect others. It goes back to Christ. When Jesus Christ was asked what is the greatest commandment, his response was to love the Lord thy God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second, he says, is like it, to love thy neighbor as thyself. Those are the greatest commandments. And they're all summed up right here in these 10 that we've studied this past quarter. And then, you know, I think I love the response of Christ's audience to that. The initial response was, he said to love thy neighbor as thyself. What was the response from the audience? Who is what? Who's my neighbor? That was the question. Think about that for a minute, guys. Jesus is there preaching. He's teaching. Somebody's trying to trick him. They says, Lord, what is the greatest commandment? He says, to love the Lord thy God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second is to love yourself. And the very first question anybody in the audience wants to know is what? Who's my neighbor? How exactly do I make this fit what you're just telling me? Oh, that's just comical to me, right? But it's human nature. It's that going back to that worldly part of us. We want to know exactly what that means. You know, nobody said, how do we love God? How do we love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind? Jesus, how do we do that? Show us how to do that better. That would have been a great response, right, Lonnie? Nobody said, how do we love our neighbor better? Nobody asked that. The first question that was asked was, who exactly is our neighbor that you're talking about, Jesus?
Give me a loophole.
Give me a loophole. Lonnie said it right there. How can I get out of doing what you're saying to do? That was the first question that we see that was asked of Christ. Guys, if we truly love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, we've got to do that first. We've got to get that right first. Because it's going to take all of our leaning on God to be able to follow the next 6. Does that make sense? In order for us to love our neighbor as ourselves, We have got to be able to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, because elsewise we can't love our neighbor as ourselves. Do you follow me? And as we look at this verse 17, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant. You know, we talked last week, David would have stayed out of a lot of trouble had he thought about the 10th commandment, right? If we think about lying, if we think about stealing, if we think about killing, the very first murder that ever occurred in the Bible that's recorded is when Cain kills Abel. Why did Cain kill Abel? He was jealous. Exactly right. In essence, Cain coveted the offering that Abel had given. Cain coveted the fact that Abel did the right thing and he done the wrong thing. This idea of coveting. Now, I know a lot of you, if you're like me, you go through these commandments and you've got a lot of them in your mind, right? But before today, if somebody asked you to name the 10 commandments, this one right here would probably be one that you left out. You know, we can name, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. We can name, honor your father and mother. Now I'm saying before today. Now, let's say before this quarter of lessons. Oftentimes we leave this one out. But this one is tied to about every other one that pertains to dealing with other people. Once we fall into this trap of wanting something that somebody else has, it's just that. It's a trap. It can lead to lots of things. Now, I'm going to go somewhere really different with this. It's the same thing. I ain't got my phone with me. And I've said this in Sunday school on many occasions. It's no different than going on Facebook and looking at pictures of all these smiling families and everything going good, and you think that way. And there's some young people that I really hope, in young families especially, that I really hope get that. Because how long does it take to take that picture? A millisecond, right? You took a picture. That's all a picture is right? That's all a picture is. Because the other 24.99 hours are spent in chaos. But that one millisecond, everything was just right, just for that picture. Guys, comparing ourselves to others is a form of this. We don't compare ourselves. God blessed us. He's given us what He's meant for us to have. And we're going to get into that, and that's a great tie-in to our conclusion of our lesson this morning. But don't get stuck in that trap of thinking what you is what you want and is all real, because it ain't. It ain't. I'm not knocking that family that posted that. I'm not knocking that at all. I think that's awesome. I think Facebook and social media is a great way to share your adventures and everything else. But I see a downfall in it, in that I feel like people are depressed and they put themselves down because they don't feel like their lives live up to that stuff they're seeing. And I don't think I'm making that up. And I challenge all of us to realize, let's celebrate with those people and celebrate with those pictures but don't for a minute think that your life doesn't live up to that. Because that's not what that picture is. And that's a challenge. And I think when we talk about this idea of coveting what our neighbors have, I really think that's a struggle that our society, and especially young people in our society, face today. They want their lives to live up to something they're seeing on that phone. And it may not be that they want to have the possessions, may not be that they want to have the things, but they want to have the life that snapshot is showing. And that's dangerous, folks. It's so dangerous. And I say it's dangerous because it leads you to be depressed in thinking you're not adequate and worthy. And truly you are. You know, I gave several Sundays back and the young man that took his life in Allegheny County, and I shared it with my high school soccer team, and that still just weighs on my heart. And you know, when we don't think we're good enough, when we don't think we measure up, when we don't think that we ever will, it leads our minds to come to some crazy ideas. And the fact of the matter is we are all special. We are all chosen. We are all perfectly and wonderfully made just to be just who we are. And I don't know how else to say that. And, you know, I'm going to say this will be the last point of it. Don't be comparing ourselves to others. The only person we should compare ourselves to is Jesus Christ. And that's it. Anyway, any discussion before we move on? Well, our last group of verses this morning, and as I've said the last several Sundays, I really enjoy the way our material has blended the commandments with passages of David and King David, and this morning we're going to look at Psalms chapter 37, verses 1 through 6. And verse 1 says, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. For they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord, and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday." And guys, I don't know of a better conclusion of these last 6 commandments, and then tying in the first 4 than these verses right here by King David. And if we look at verse 1, it says, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity." Let's start right there. How many of us have ever seen someone that we know is not a Christian, and yet it seems like they are blessed beyond all measure? We've seen that, right? And we get mad at that. And we want to know, we ask the question, why? Why does somebody that lives their life like that get rewarded the way they're rewarded? We can't lie. Can't nobody say that we ain't thought that we don't have that thought in our mind. And David says, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity." David says, don't fret about it. Don't be envious. Don't covet what they have. And then he says in verse 2, "For they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb." Guys, going back to this idea of comparing, going back to this idea, David gives us the answer to all that. The judgment's going to come. And what happens on this earth doesn't mean twiddly-do. That all that matters is the treasure that we lay about in heaven. And that's what David's saying in verse 1 through 2. Verse 3 says, "Trust in the Lord and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine own heart." Delight thyself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of thine own heart. You know, if we are stealing, if we are lying, if we are coveting, if we are committing adultery, if we are killing, it's because we don't
believe God is who He says He is, and He'll do what He says He'll do. Think about that. If I'm coveting what you have, that's saying that what God has given me isn't good enough, and I want more.
It's like idolatry.
Exactly. Exactly, Michael. It's saying whether I believe, I've just thought this thought, but if you take any of the commandments, and if I do not stand up and withhold any of those commandments, what I'm ultimately saying is God ain't good enough. Is that an accurate statement? I'm saying God isn't capable. He isn't able. He isn't truthful. That's ultimately what I'm saying. I may not verbally say it, but my actions are reflecting that. King David says, trust in the Lord and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and He shall give thee the desires of thine heart. If we truly, truly, truly believe that, then there won't be covetousness in our heart. There won't be untruth in our heart. There won't be the thought of stealing, adultery, killing, honoring our father and mother. They won't be not putting God first and remember the Sabbath day. They won't be using God's name in vain. They won't be having idols and any other gods before us. If we truly buy into what David's saying right here. And when we go and we leave this building, when we walk out of here this morning, if we trust in the Lord with all our heart, if we lean not on our own understanding, then if we truly do those things, then this idea of coveting, this idea of stealing, this idea of breaking any of these commandments kind of fall away, right? Because we're putting all our trust in Him. And if we put all our trust in Him, we're not putting our trust in what else? The world, right? There's only two things to put our trust in. There's absolutely only two things to put your trust in. You either put your trust in God or you put your trust in the world. There's no other option. There ain't a C, D, E, F. There's just A and B. And if we put our trust in Him, then we're going back to what David says. We're thankful for what we have. We realize that God is the provider of what we have, and we're right where we're supposed to be. And as we conclude this lesson on the commandments, as we conclude this quarter, I hope that just bears into my heart, and I hope it bears into all of y'all's heart. Verse 5 says, commit thy way into the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. Commit thy way into the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. Commit thy way into the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. The question for this passage is in our book says, what are the consequences for society when people don't live with honesty and integrity? What are the consequences for society when people don't live with honesty and integrity? Downfall. Unhappiness. Very good. It goes back to that story when I was 8 years old. I don't want to feel that way no more.
Start accepting that which is wrong and calling it good.
Now, to Lonnie's point is exactly right. It's those calluses, right, Lonnie? When you think the consequences for society when people don't live with honesty and integrity, it's those calluses. We become, well, that's just norm. Commit thy way into the Lord, trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. Verse 6, and He shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. He shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Can you think of anybody better than King David to write verse 6? David says, and he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light and thy judgment as the noonday. David understood this, right? Because David faced God's judgment. He faced God's righteousness and all that God blessed him with. Let's think about this story of David. We got 10 minutes. Bear with me. We've done this whole quarter so far. We've looked at how the commandments and read back in King David's life, right? Let's conclude this right here with what verse 6 says. That King David was a shepherd boy, tending his father's sheep. He trusted in God. God gave him deliverance over the wolves and the lions and the bear out there in the wilderness. He trusted in God to get him through that. King David was, as a shepherd boy, was brought out before Samuel the prophet. Samuel the prophet comes through the village looking for the next king of Israel. And he asks Jesse to bring all his sons out. Jesse brings all his sons out. Samuel says, nope, ain't none of them him. Ain't you got somebody else? What was their response? Oh, there's old David up in the... there's old ruddy David out in the wilderness taking care of the sheep. Samuel says, go fetch him. They went and brought David out there, and God says, that's my man. Now think about that, guys. Think about that. Here's this young man. All he's been able to do his whole life, his big brothers, go take care of the sheep, boy. And he gets called down, and as soon as he walks up, Samuel says, that's God's man right there. Samuel anoints him. Think about that. I get cold chills almost, right? You know, it ain't no difference in each one of you, right? God said, Gail, you're my man. That day, whenever it was. He said, Gail, you're mine. Nathan, you're mine. Bonnie, you're mine. That's what he did to each and every one of us. He called us out of that wilderness, and he brought us up, and he says, all them other ones, that ain't who I was looking for. I was looking for you. And that's what God did to David. How awesome is that, right? Okay, so then David goes about his life. He keeps going and looking after the sheep. And Daddy says, boy, go take... I say boy because that's what I tell my boy. Boy, go take some food to your brothers. They're at the battlefield. They're doing something important. You're just taking care of the sheep. Go get some food. Take them to your brother. So David goes off and he takes food to his brothers, and he just happens to pull up when this great big feller comes out and says, who's going to fight me? And in those words, he defiles Israel. He defiles Israel's God. David hears it. He goes up to his brothers, and I can just see Benjamin. I can just see Benjamin. Boys, what y'all going to do about that? And his brother says, what do you mean what we going to do about that? And David says, that man just defiled you and God and everybody else. Somebody go whoop him. And they says, don't you see how big he is? And he's been a warrior since his youth. And David says, that ain't going to fly. So he goes and talks to King Saul. And Saul says about the same thing. Boy, you need to grow a little bit. You don't understand these things. David said, I understand one thing, and that is God is for me. Who can be against me? And so David goes out and he fights that giant, and we know the rest of that story, right? Just what a marvelous. King Saul says, David, you'll marry my daughter. King Saul brings him in, and he's right into his fold, and David goes out and he fights and he wins his victories, and they write songs about him. And the songs say as much as that Saul killed his thousands and David kills his 10,000s. Just mighty warrior for God. Well, then Saul gets jealous, and we see that Saul falls guilty to a lot of what we've been talking about. Saul covets what David has. He covets it because the folks love David and they don't love him. He covets David because David has this relationship with God that he don't have. And so he goes and tries to kill David. And he chases them all over the known world, if you will. And yet David stays true and doesn't use the opportunity he has, as we talked about, to take Saul's own life. And David's made, eventually Saul dies and David's made king. And he goes, and one of my favorite stories about King David is that David brings the ark back into the Jerusalem. And it says that he danced and he sung in front of the ark and said his wife says, "You look like a fool." I love that. I don't know that she said you look like a fool, but she was chastising him. David must dance like I do. And anyway, she says, "David, you're embarrassing me." And David says, "I don't care. I'm going to dance for my Lord, my God." Now, what a wonderful illustration of the king dancing before God and dancing for God. And so you got that story of David, but then it doesn't take long and David's army goes out to battle and David stays at home. And we know that he falls and he sees Bathsheba, and we know that whole story. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. But then David asks for forgiveness, and God is faithful to forgive. But God says, you got to live with those consequences of your actions. And so God restores David, and him and Bathsheba have a son, and that son is Samuel. And we know that Samuel is one of the greatest kings that's ever lived of all time. Solomon, that's right. Thank you. Solomon, one of the greatest kings of all time. But guys, when David writes in verse 6, "And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday," David knew what he was writing about. He knew what he was saying. And guys, as we conclude this lesson and these lessons on the Ten Commandments, my prayer for myself and for all of us is that we'll see how important it is that we do live a life of integrity. Because we are the only church that many folks will ever see. And so we can make a difference through that way. And in our lives, realizing what these commandments were about. You look at David's life as an example and compare, and in a way to help us grow closer and closer to God. Anyway, any more discussion before we close? If not, thank y'all.